Hi, my name is Claire, and I'm going to present a paper named In Love with a Corporation Without Knowing It, an Asymmetrical Relationship. This paper focuses on the emotional attachment to social robots, as well as the ethical and legal challenges that this poses, and the solutions. First, we'll talk about what social robots are, then the intellectual premises of this work. Then we'll go into emotional attachment to robots and what ethical and legal implications that it has. And finally, we will propose some legal solutions. There's many different definitions of social robots, but most of them agree that social robots are robots that interact with humans in socially acceptable ways. Social robots have been deployed in a variety of settings, including in factories. This is the Boston Dynamic robot that can carry very heavy loaded, it can jump, it can delicately grab things, and it can run up and down stairs. They've been deployed in nursing homes. This is Robert. It's being tested in Japanese nursing homes, and it can carry patients. They've been deployed inside of homes. This is French robot Buddy. It's sold as an emotional robot, companion robot. It can surveil the house, remind you of your appointments, as well as do things like play with children. And they've been deployed in more private spaces. This is Sex Robot Harmony. Now let's look at the intellectual premises that we're building our analysis on. There's been a long-standing debate that started with literature about whether people actually believe in fiction. That's Magritte's painting, which says, "This is not a pipe," and in fact it's not, it's a representation of one. And there's been a long-standing debate that extended to social robots, in which author Sparrow said that using social robot is morally wrong, or at least getting attached to them is morally wrong, because it consists in self-deception, it consists in sentimentality, and you choose to believe that the robot has feelings for you when you know it doesn't. Rodonio responded to that argument by saying that that's not the case, that people can actually have real emotions for robots, even if they know that robots are not alive. However, he mentions that he thinks robots could be harmful if deployed at a large scale in society, because they would change how people interact with one another. And that resonates with an interview that one of the co-creators of Sex Robot Samantha gave, in which he was saying that Sex Robot Samantha saved his marriage because his wife was not always available during the day to have sex. In this case, you can see that this sex robot ended opportunities that a person had to deal with his own frustration, and that as a result, it does change how humans negotiate alterity, and it prevents them from having to reach compromises like Rodonio had predicted. We're building this work on two theories that are kind of complementing each other nicely. They both build on much scholarly work and generalize them. Steven Pinker's How the Mind Works basically makes the argument that emotions are not a vestige of prehistoric times, that they're not just meant to help us run away from lions and survive in basic ways, such as provide us with food or make us reproduce. He says that human emotions have actually evolved quite recently, and that they are meant to secure cooperation, and that we are social beings who need to live in group to survive, and that human emotions help us do that by, for instance, making us have empathy for others or love, feeling jealousy, and all of those things are actually ways for a genome to tell us what to do in order to survive. including navigate social settings. And this is complemented nicely by Harari, especially his theory on fiction that posits that humans are at the top of the food chain because they can cooperate at very large scales with other humans they don't know. He uses the example of boarding a plane. Of course, you don't know the pilot personally, you don't know the other passengers personally, you don't know any of the engineers that created the plane, and yet you board it because you believe in collective fiction, you believe in nations, you believe in companies, and basically fiction is, in his, according to his theory, what made us survive and in societies. In fact, there's another whole body of research showing that fiction builds empathy. And in this funny experiment, the authors had a control group and a treatment group, and the treatment group was read a story, which is a short story by playwright Chekhov, and the treatment group was read the same facts, but instead of being left as the story that it is, it was rewritten in the form of an administrative report. And the people being read the story experienced emotions, and the people being read the administrative report version did not. And so this is all to say that fiction actually produces real emotions, but that these emotions even prompt us to act exactly like Steven Pinker has described. In fact, fiction help us build real empathy toward others and can be a motivator. In that specific study, people after being read the story were more open to change and novelty. It's been shown that people can actually get emotionally attached to robots. The first study was of the vacuum cleaners Roomba. Sung and Guo showed that people actually projected intentionality on their Roombas because of the way it seemed to be choosing where to go, that they also believe that their Roombas had distinct personalities. Kate Darling also worked a lot on human attachment to robots and showed that people can actually get attached to robots, especially people with high empathy. For instance, she showed it with those cute dinosaurs that cry if they're upside down, as well as these robotic insects that people with high empathy refuse to crush, although it was requested of them. And in fact, researchers have identified the biggest factors of human attachment to robots: movement that seems intentional, baby features, so a very round face, a big eye to face ratio, voice modulations that seem to express emotions, having a background story, which taps exactly into what we said about fiction, and shared experiences. So in that study that we're referencing, people were asked to watch funny YouTube videos with robots that were laughing when the video was funny, and others were watching it with a robot that wasn't reacting. And people felt bonded to the robot that laughed in the same time as them. This is to illustrate the background story example. This is robot Erica, and I'm going to let it tell you about its background story.
However, I can tell you about one of my early memories. One time they were testing my waist pitch actuator. It's the joint in my waist that allows me to bow, like this, which is obviously important in Japan. But you see, somebody forgot to attach my chair to the floor, so I fell down and damaged my face. It was horrible. You know, I can't move my arms or legs, so all I can really do is sit here and look pretty. But after that I looked so grotesque, and silicone doesn't heal. Maybe that doesn't sound so bad to you, but it means they ripped off my arms and legs and put me in a dark box for days. I suppose beauty has its price, but I'm glad to be back to normal again. I think that the process of development and debugging could be very traumatic, so maybe it is best that my personality does not emerge from my formative memories. Maybe that is why people do not remember their first few years as children.
So you can see that's the perfect example of a story that would foster human attachment to a robot. You see that Erika talked about her traumatic memories, her first memory of being inside this dark box. And if you lived with a robot after several years that told you, I'm really traumatized because I broke my arm, it's going to cost $10,000 to repair, but I'm very injured. You can see that that could potentially be an ethical concern. So let's get straight into the ethical challenges. First, the ones that were identified in previous research. Kello identified different types of privacy challenges. One is direct surveillance. Another one is that social robots are introduced in historically protected spaces, such as inside of the home. So now we have recording devices in a historically protected space. Another one is the type of data collection that happens based on the interaction between the human and the robot. For instance, if a person has relationships with a sex robot, then how that person interacts, or with a romantic companion robot, what form of attachment the human has, and how it was triggered, are type of data that are extremely sensitive and could lead to manipulating someone. Finally, social robots reduce the opportunities for solitude. Studies have shown that when you are in a room with a social robot, you do not behave as if you were alone, you behave as if there were another human. So it's the idea that there's a reduction in opportunities for self-reflection just being alone. Other challenges that were identified in previous literature are the impact on human interaction that we talked about with Rodonio, manipulation from companies, accepting 4G devices more easily because we're attached to them, safety concerns, consequences caused by the lack of awareness of the social robot. For instance, if you ask a social robot to read you your medical result, but someone enters the room in the meantime, and the social robot goes ahead and divulges private information, that, for instance, would be a concern. And finally, the lack of serendipity. Will we still have chances for randomness, chance encounters, if the space for what's unexpected is reduced and we're never alone? Now I'd like to go into the legal implications that stem from the ethical challenges. The law relies on the assumption of free will mostly. For instance, people would not be accountable for their criminal actions if there was no free will whatsoever. Another example is that we assume that people can consent, for instance, to entering contracts. However, there are limitations. In general, in European law, we consider that what's illegal is what hurts others, but one can exercise their free will to harm oneself. For instance, suicide is not illegal anymore in the 21st century. BDSM acts against oneself are considered to be legal, and one can consent to them. However, there are specific protections from the law. For instance, if someone is manipulated into drinking and commit a criminal act, then that would be considered as an attenuating circumstance. If someone is under undue influence, which means that someone else is substituting their will for that person's will. And of course, the law considers specific individuals as protected persons, so people who are more vulnerable, such as children, people with certain disabilities. Finally, the law considers that when there is an asymmetrical relationship between an individual and a company, for instance, because they have power differential, or because of asymmetry of information, then consumer law is there to reestablish some level of equilibrium. For instance, by imposing that tobacco companies place warning labels onto their packets because tobacco is addictive, and so it diminishes the free will of the person once they're addicted to the substance. In terms of social robots, we identify 3 areas of consent slash free will that are critical to address. The first level is at the purchase point. If someone buys a social robot, it is of paramount importance that they're informed and that they understand that the social robot does not have feelings, emotions, personality, individuality, that it's not living. And it's really important, especially for those social robots that have background stories, express emotions. So here, for instance, Buddy is marketed as an emotional companion, and you can see it says that he will sometimes be grumpy if you have not paid attention to him, or sometimes without any particular reason, just because that morning he's not in a good mood. And Buddy is specifically marketed to use with children. So it's really important that everyone in the household be informed. Another level of consent is over time, the idea being that once you are emotionally involved, emotionally attached to a social robot, it's not clear that you're exercising as much free will as at the point of purchase, and that your level of consent sort of diminishes over time as you get involved. It could be similar to how you get addicted to a substance like tobacco, actually. And finally, there's the question of responsibility. So for instance, if our brains are wired to make us experience emotions toward things that seem to be living, just like Steven Pinker shows, and if that's, we're wired like this so that we cooperate with people because that's the product of evolution, and that our genome is telling us to act in such and such way. For instance, if you have a man and he walks into his house and he sees his neighbor forcing himself onto his wife, he's probably going to get really angry, and he's probably going to physically assault the neighbor to protect his wife. And that would be considered self-defense in the case that in the event that the wife wasn't consentful. However, if the same man has been living with a sexual and emotional companion robot that he's attached to, and that one day he enters his house and walks on his neighbor having sex with his robot, he will probably have the exact same emotional incentive, the exact same impulse reaction, and probably punch his neighbor as well, except this time the law will probably say, well, that wasn't self-defense because this is not a human. This is an object and you assaulted someone. When from the person's perspective, it's not clear that it's much different, given that the biological incentives are the same. So we're suggesting a few solutions to these challenges that we just raised. One is to distinguish between primary and incidental users in the household, and to make sure to regulate for both. Incidental users are the ones who are not purchasing the robot but still live in the same household, and as a result will suffer the same consequences and will deal with the same challenges. We also suggest to protect vulnerable persons differently from social robots. And finally, and we'll go into practical solutions in the next slide, we suggest distinguishing between robots whose end is not related to emotional attachment and do not need it, and robots whose end requires some emotional attachment or is emotional attachment. In order to protect vulnerable persons, we suggest 2 things mainly. One, robots should not be left alone with a vulnerable person. They should be used in assistance with someone else. So for instance, Robert is meant to help carry people, but as you saw in the video, there was an actual human assisting the robot. In the case of robot introduced with children on the autism spectrum. In some studies, they have been used in coordination with a parent or with a social worker. And so we suggest that it should always be the case that the robot is not left alone with the vulnerable person, including children. We also suggest that robots should not be able to speak about themselves. They should not say that they desire things or they want things, talk about their memories, have a background story, because these are the kind of things that will promote empathy and make humans react as if they were interacting with other humans. When in fact, when a human is emotionally attached to a robot, it's really with the company that makes the robot that the human interacts. It's the company that collects the data. It's the company that decides how to program the robot. And so the idea is that that introduces the biggest power asymmetry that's ever been in terms of consumer goods. As a result, we're also suggesting to protect all consumers, primary and incidental users of social robots. In terms of design, we suggest that design should be based on purpose. So the idea is to minimize traits that look like humans and animals, and behaviors that mimic them. We suggest that robots should regularly change appearance so that humans do not get too emotionally attached like they would to a person. For instance, one could switch their robot voice every week, say, so that the person at least projects different personalities onto the robot and not always the same one, building a history of emotional bond. In terms of use, we suggest that there should be one robot for one purpose. For instance, it shouldn't be the same robot acting as a home security system and surveilling your home, and the same that plays with your children. We also suggest to introduce space and time limitations. For instance, one could say that when someone hires a sex worker and pay for the sex worker to tell them they're in love with them and such things, they do choose to have some level of self-deception because that's what they want to hear and they're buying an experience. However, living with a robot that will tell you that it loves you frequently makes the consumer much more vulnerable, and as a result, we suggest limiting those experiences to specific places outside of the home and specific times. In terms of contracts, we suggest having a type of lease contract between the robotic company and the consumer, because as we saw, the effects of emotional bond to robots increase over time, and we believe that a sales contract is not enough. And that the lease could have a specific deadline. It could say, okay, this person is renting this robot for this purpose. Here's what the robot has the right to do, and it will last, say, 6 months. And that would also allow for frequent constant renewal, just as each time you buy a cigarette packet, although you're getting more and more addicted over time, you're reminded that it's dangerous by the warning label. So the idea is also to renew consent with the buyer. In terms of data, we suggest that data collection should be minimized to its minimal necessity, just like European regulations suggest, and that there should be no central collection of data. And finally, for the incidental users, we suggest that other household members need to give consent for the purchase as well, because they will have the same consequences of the primary user, and incidental users need to be regularly informed over time. These are our references. And if you have any question, please direct them to myself, Claire, at cboine@bu.edu. Thank you.